it's an absolute pleasure and privilege to be with you today. I've long admired your work, all your ventures and roles, and I've absolutely loved your book, which I have here, Net Positive, authored with Andrew Winston. It is a seminal work. It's substantive, well researched. It's a manifesto for what leaders and individuals all around the world should be doing. So I'm delighted to be with you today.
No, thanks, David. I'm delighted to be in Lensfield on the line, as you call it, and good to see you again.
Indeed, indeed. Thank you. Thank you. So we are obviously going to talk about the title of the book and the concept of net positive. And you talk about companies playing not to lose rather than playing to win. I'm curious about what winning means and what that concept, and then we'll dig deeper in terms of leaders and so forth. So what does that mean?
Well, first of all, if I go back to the book, Net Positive, How Courageous Companies Thrive by Giving More Than They Take, what we were trying to do with the book is change the mindset, and doing that by starting a movement, basically to explain what good looks like. Most companies, frankly, are in the CSR mode right now, which is corporate social responsibility. Nothing, undesirable about that, but it really deals with being less bad. A little bit less carbon in the air, a little bit less plastics in the ocean, a little bit less deforestation in your value chain. And that's very much where you see the commitments as laid out in sustainability reports, or if you go to things like the COP26 in Glasgow and all that. But what we would argue in the book is less bad is simply not good enough anymore. This world has overshot its planetary boundaries. World Overshoot Day, which is the day that we use up more resources than the planet can replenish, is this year, July 28th. I would argue that after that date we steal from future generations. So people say, okay, I understand that, less bad is still bad, so I want to be net zero. So a lot of commitments are now coming out to be sustainable, neither good nor bad. But what we would argue is that to survive in the future, to solve these burning issues like climate change and inequality, the only thinking that is really positions you well for the future is if you think regenerative, restorative, reparative. And that is what we call net positive. And net positive companies take a responsibility of their total handprint in society, all consequences intended or not. They work for the long term. They see shareholder return as a result of what they do, not as a myopic objective. And they work on the broader transformations that we now need in society. And one of the hallmarks of courageous companies, not surprisingly, is courageous leaders that are willing to take responsibility for their impact, that are willing to set targets that are really needed versus targets that they can get away with, that are willing to work in these broader partnerships which sometimes are difficult. And as it gets to targets, what we see is first and foremost there's a lack of publicly setting targets. Believe it or not, half of the companies in the world, the major companies we're talking about, don't even disclose diversity targets or pay targets, let alone targets on some of the other areas of living wages or people with disabilities in their companies, or targets on climate change. 20% of the companies set climate change targets, less than 8% set targets that are in line with the Paris agreements and based on the 2030 timeframe versus 2050. So it's still a area where people don't like to expose themselves. And frankly, most CEOs feel comfortable, aided often by their PR departments and others, to set targets that they know they can achieve already, or sometimes have achieved. So I call them targets not to lose versus targets to win. And the reality, what the world now needs to address these burning issues of climate change and inequality, is set the real targets that science demands. And that's difficult because these are targets that you might feel uncomfortable about, where you might not have all the answers on how to achieve them. And that's why it's important that it starts with courage, and why you have a strong purpose in the company. These are all the factors needed to set these more audacious targets. Very much what we did with Unilever when we started the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan. We looked at the science and said we have to decarbonize our value chain. We have to be gender equal in our value chain. We have to ensure that everybody has living wages. We have to be sure that all of our products are sourced sustainably, that there's no deforestation in our value chains, that all factories run on zero waste. So these are often absolute targets, and yeah, they're difficult to achieve. Some of it you can do alone, but a lot of it requires these broader partnerships that we briefly talked about.
Wow. I mean, it's quite breathtaking, both the impact and the agenda. And it makes me think, if you are talking with CEOs who don't get it, i.e. on a spectrum of they're not doing very much to they're doing something but setting those targets to not to lose. What is it? It's a lack of courage. I get that. Is it ignorance on their part of some of the effects, even though some of them they'll see day in, day out, the environment and so forth? Is it not understanding the systemic role that they play as an organization? Or beyond courage, what else is getting in the way of CEOs actually taking practical steps to address these issues?
Well, first and foremost, it is in everybody's interest to be actively involved. Climate change affects us all, inequality affects us all, and many of the other burning issues that we need to deal with increasingly are coming into our business models. And businesses are paying the price for that. Businesses cannot succeed in these failing societies, nor do I believe that they can be bystanders in a system that gives them life in the first place. Most of our economies in the world predominantly run by the private sector, if you like it or not. 65% of the GDP is the private sector, or 85% of job creation, 95% of financial flow. We simply cannot solve these issues without an active involvement of the private sector. And as you say, there are many reasons for that, but the predominant reason is frankly a lack of knowledge of what is possible. We always underestimate the speed of technology, and there's a lot of preconceived notions about things that aren't possible, or if you want to do the right thing, it must be costing you more, there must be something to it. There is obviously the pressure that comes in from the financial markets, which pushes many companies still regretfully to the shorter term. There's a fear for working in the broader partnerships that might expose some inconvenient truths or need some adaptation in style or decision power that people feel uncomfortable with. But broadly, it is also a system that pushes back in a sense. Our reward system is very much about return on financial capital. We don't yet have a clear system on measuring social, human, or environmental capital. So we need to broaden not only our own courage and leadership skills, our own awareness, our ability to work with others, but we need to also look at the broader systems changes. And then there is obviously a small group of companies that continues to defend their own self-interest, and frankly they get a disproportionate share of voice, regretfully still, especially in the media.
When you talk in your book about learning and unlearning, and you touched on it there, in terms of if you're trying to develop leaders throughout the organization, not just in the C-suite, throughout. Where do you, if you were a CEO in this case that got the program, wanted to affect change, how do you actually build up that capability and know-how in an organization to affect it? Because you need more than just the top team. You need people throughout the organizations, the people working on partnerships, on the supply chain, commercial deals, to sort of do it in concert. But how do you build that new learning and also encourage unlearning?
Yeah, so unlearning is an incredibly important aspect because there are so many things changing nowadays. We see the scale of change that is needed is well beyond the industrial revolution. We need to reinvent a global economy that is totally dependent on carbon. We need to change our mobility systems, the way we feed people. It's a humongous challenge, and it has to be done in a time frame that is even shorter than what we had with, call it the technological revolution. So there's enormous pressure on businesses, and this comes at a time that you deal with the economic crisis, the climate crisis, the social equality, equity crisis, the COVID health crisis, the geopolitical crisis. I mean, there's a lot on the plate of a CEO. So if you don't create that capacity in yourselves to be agile and resilient at the same time, to learn and adapt and be out there and find out what some of the best practices are that are needed, but also to get rid of your preconceived notions and biasness, which is sometimes much harder to do, we will not get there. So these things are important. In our book, Net Positive, We talk about a sense of purpose or duty or service, if you want to call it, as one of the key traits. It is very clear that if you have a strong sense of purpose, the really why you are here, the reason for being as a company. Colin Meyer in his book Prosperity calls it to profitably address the issues of people and planet. But it is that strong purpose, I think, that keeps you focused and determined to pursue some of these more audacious goals. We talk about leaders having a high level of empathy or compassion, humanity, humility. We saw that very much during COVID. These are leaders that are in touch with the world around them and have a higher awareness. It feeds the purpose as well, obviously. They're outside-in people versus what we would call inside-out people. Out of that comes courage. You know, courage comes actually from the French word cœur, which is the heart. I always believe that anything that goes through the heart will stick in the brain, but anything that goes just in and out of the brain will probably have less value. And then, you know, the moral leadership that is needed to work at this higher level. I often say that leadership only starts when you realize that putting yourself to the service of others is something that makes you better off, not to be very self-centered. And that increasingly has to happen by forming these transformative partnerships. So for people to create that capacity, I always talk very simply about having your physical fitness, which often leads you to emotional fitness. Then you need to create some space for mental fitness, time to do other things, read books, talk to other people, be out there. And ultimately it's about spiritual fitness, which, you know, in this discussion we might call purpose. Really feeling strongly inside your DNA, you know, as part of your blood, so to speak, that you're here for a bigger purpose than yourself.
It's very moving. If you're a manager or a leader in an organization that has grown up with a narrow view on life, so not all those aspects of fitness, and you've done very well, you've delivered or smashed all your commercial targets, but there's either pressure from outside to get on the program, to do this manifesto, and or there's a little voice perhaps in his or her head that says, come on, is this something you can nurture? Do you see people who have shifted from a more inward, mercenary, narrow, short-term perspective to this more systemic view?
Well, you know, we've always had to deal in our organization with people that were tremendous business people, but they would and get business results, but would kill the people around them. Or they were self-centered, or they were very bad bosses, or they used management techniques that were not in line with values of a company. And any company that wants to rise to the challenge to be long-term resilient, to have the right culture, etc., would not really reward those people on results alone. They would also really look at the aspects of people development, which is a longer-term investment in the company. You know, the higher you go in the company, the more you depend on other people. So we've always been able to work with these trade-offs. Now it's actually easier, because I would argue that increasingly it's more difficult, David, to get these longer term results and to get them consistently if you don't take care of these other stakeholders, if you don't build in the aspect of limited resources that we have, if you don't take care of people in the value chain. We now have the hard data that these companies that run under the multi-stakeholder longer term formats with putting purpose and sustainability smack in the middle of their strategies, these companies in general outperform. This is one of the reasons why we see the financial market starting to move, more and more companies making commitments on climate, albeit not enough, or why the issue of the social of ESG is coming higher on the agenda. So the market is moving. And if it's not moving by yourselves because of these enormous opportunities, it will be forced to move even by increasing government legislation that we see. The European taxonomy or Green Deal, a good example of that, but also in other jurisdictions. Or you'd be forced to move by signals from the market or your own employees that increasingly are demanding these more responsible business models. The Great Resignation in the US is a good example of the millennials or the Gen Zs getting disengaged from companies that don't have that stronger purpose. But you know, so there is a moral reason to move, which is very clear and understood. People will suffer, from climate change if we don't address it, or more people will go to bed hungry. So inequality will go up. So that's the moral reason. But I think ultimately what swings people is the economic reason. And we are at a point, and this is probably where COVID has helped us, that people are starting to realize that the cost of not acting is actually higher than the cost of acting. COVID has cost us $17 trillion in the US and Europe alone to save lives and livelihoods. $25 trillion lost this decade in GDP, and we're nowhere near out of the woods, I would argue. That's infinitely more than what it would cost us to prevent the issues. In this case, protection of biodiversity, COVID being one of these zoonotic diseases like, by the way, SARS, Ebola, Zika, Asian flu, and another 3 or 4 waiting around the corner. So we're getting to that point that it is actually more beneficial to attack these negative externalities. And the financial market increasingly is seeing this not just as risk mitigation, but as an enormous investment opportunity, and is betting increasingly on the companies that position themselves well for this future that you asked about, which obviously is a more inclusive, more equitable, more sustainable future in harmony with fellow citizens, but also with planet Earth.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm struck with you're struck with your eloquence again, and also the number of hats you wear and the number of roles you play and have played in the past. In a nutshell, I'm curious, how would you describe your role and contribution to what you just described?
Well, I moved from, if I may call it, formal or board authority when I was the CEO of Unilever. Obviously, a 50 billion conglomerate in 190 countries gives you a platform and a voice, and certainly enough spending power to do something about things. And that's your obligation. Viktor Frankl said it well in his book, Man's Search for Meaning. When they built the Statue of Liberty on the east coast of the United States, they forgot to build the Statue of Responsibility on the west coast. So these things go hand in hand, and that was a platform. But that was then. Now in my life after Unilever, I have to draw more on my moral authority, and frankly I find that much more powerful and much more satisfying. And where I focus on having helped develop these sustainable development goals, these 17 goals that were approved by 193 countries in the United Nations in 2015, with objective to not leave anybody behind, to irreversibly eradicate poverty and do that in a more sustainable and equitable way. I focus on the 2 key drivers, which are climate change and inequality, both probably 2 sides of the same coin. And I do that via a platform I created called Imagine, where our theory of change is very simply bringing a critical mass of CEOs together across the value chain by industry sector. Think about fashion, tourist and travel, food. And if you have a critical mass of 20-25% of CEOs, you can not only collectively, with more courage, change these companies, but also start working on the broader systems changes. Collectively in food, we're moving to regenerative agriculture, or in fashion to regenerative cotton, or one of the biggest purchase agreements collectively on green energy. So we're moving things forward at a faster pace than otherwise would happen. And then at the same time, working these broader systems changes, which I link to the COP process, the climate change process, the COP27 coming up in Egypt, the G7, G20, but also the governments themselves. So we link it to the broader systems changes. And then the second area I focus on, which is underpinning and call it an enabler, is really leadership development. This ultimately, David, is not a crisis of food security or climate change or inequality. Those are the symptoms. This is a crisis of greed, of apathy, of selfishness, and frankly our most important education, and in our case our business or management education, is frankly not delivering anymore. Judy Samuelson of the Aspen Institute did research once, and they were interviewing business people, students, before they went into the business schools. They all wanted to change the world and make it better, and they were interviewing the same people after they came out of the business schools. They wanted to work for Goldman Sachs and earn a lot of money. So from wonderful human beings, we turn them into little monsters on steroids, or little Milton Friedmans. It's just not working anymore. So we have to create a broader base of leadership. So we're working with the book on creating the concept of net positive universities. We're working with an organization called Prime, 865 universities, on developing the new principles for responsible management education. We're having a core group of 30 universities working on the book and really making sustainability, if you want to, and purpose the core of the curriculum, not just a side course or an elective, creating the broader cooperative leaders versus the competitive leaders, the moral leaders that we want, that understand how to operate in this environment across these multi-stakeholder boundaries, if you want to. So leadership on the one hand, and systems change on the other hand, all geared towards climate change and inequality.
That is a huge program, and what I love about it is you are looking at all the different interventions that you can make, from big picture policy all the way through to leadership development and obviously education at different levels as well. Going back to school education as well, I would argue, as well as executive education. So if you are straddling those two worlds, and somebody said to you, a chair of a board, and I know you're a chair yourself, came to you and said, look, we're appointing a CEO and we'd love you to interview a raft of candidates. What three things, you're only allowed three, not two, not four, three, what three characteristics would you look for in a, if you like, generic CEO aligned to the program and the manifesto you just talked through?
Curiosity, high level of awareness or engagement with the world. So I put that under the one word, curiosity. Humility. Humility would be empathy, compassion. So I put that under the one word of humility. And then a strong purpose, really understanding ultimately, as I said before, that it is about servicing others, and by doing so being better off yourself as well. So if you have that combination of curiosity, humility and strong purpose, if I only may choose three, world is a little bit more complicated than that, but I think that would go a long way, to be honest, in creating the leaders that we need. And in fact, during COVID, we have seen that bifurcation happening at two levels. At the company strategy level, we clearly saw that companies that were more focused on the multi-stakeholder, longer-term purpose at the core, sustainability embedded throughout their organizations, in general performed better than the ones that were myopically focused on the shareholder. The same you saw in the financial market, where the ESG funds over a longer period of time clearly outperformed the non-ESG funds, if you want to. And we saw that same bifurcation actually around the leadership level, that these type of leaders that we are just describing instill a higher sense of trust or confidence in an environment that is actually very uncertain and lots of people having angst and worry about the future. It's those leaders that you want to work for in the end, and they unlock that extra level of engagement that makes the difference between being an average company and being a successful company.
If you look at the tenure of a CEO, there are certain critical moments, of course, where they can make or break their impact. Whether through your own experience or the CEOs you've worked with and admired, what are the most critical or imprintable moments that they need to master in order to affect the systemic contribution that you're talking about? What are the critical moments?
Well, Mark Twain said there are two critical moments in life: the moment you were born and the moment you found out why you were born. So you don't need to be a CEO for that second moment. The first moment you don't control. You can be grateful about it. Most of the CEOs should realize first and foremost that they have won the lottery ticket of life by probably being born in an environment where education was provided for them, where food was available, where they didn't die because of infectious diseases. They didn't do anything for it, but they had won the lottery ticket of life. So that brings me to the second reason why you were born. If you have won that lottery ticket of life, you only belong to 5% of the world population. It's your duty, I think, your obligation to put yourself to the other 95%. The world cannot function if we don't fight for these basic human values like dignity and respect, equity, compassion. And if you're in a position to do something about that, you don't need to be a CEO. In a position to do something about it, I think you really have to. It's being silent or turning your back to things that are important ultimately makes you complicit the crime to some extent of not attacking these issues. We've seen it very much in politics, where too many CEOs stood by and were silent, and the boundaries got moved, and the boundaries of morality got moved at the same time, and it's very difficult to move it back. So that level of consciousness or awareness has to start well before becoming a CEO. Once you are a CEO, I think there are some crucial moments there. I don't personally believe in the first 100 days. I think that's a little bit of a slogan to sell more business books. But I do believe at the moment of when you start, that you just have a small window to bring fresh thinking and different strategies to a company before the issues become your problem. And that's something you want to avoid. So
you feel that 100 days is a little bit of an artificial construct, and you've got to start well, but you know.
It is an artificial concept. I took 3 months to study Unilever before I took the CEO job. I talked to a lot of people, but the day I took the job, I abolished guidance, I abolished quarterly reporting, I moved our compensation system to the longer term, because we just had to get going to get this company back on track. And then I worked a year on collective purpose of our key leaders to then develop this company purpose that is being now well known as the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan. So you take the time what it needs to do something right. It's not important to be first, it's important to be right first, and spend the time you need on that. But you get going from day one on the things that count, as well as your journey as a leader has to start well before being a CEO. Now, unfortunately, the average tenure of a CEO is less than 5 years now, 4.5 years of a Fortune 500 company. Unfortunately, the public life of a company has gone down from 67 years when I was born to 17 years now, which would suggest that we simply don't have the right leaders, and may I argue boards as well in many of the companies. Yes. And boards have a key role to play as well. Many of the board members are tremendous. They run their companies very well, but they are from a different era. Often they are retired and grew up and were CEOs when the challenges that we have currently were really not on their plates. So the knowledge on ESG and how that translates into value creation, the importance of climate change and being climate competent is very low. Often these boards also don't represent society. We still have a low representation of racial diversity, of gender diversity, of disability. That is a significant part of the world population. So if we don't reflect that better, and if we don't bring those skills in, then boards in general are part of the change that needs to happen in order to attack some of these challenges we talked about.
Absolutely, absolutely. In Last Fear on the Line, we look behind the book, the agenda, the program, and we look to the person as well. And as we draw to a close, I'm curious, if not a little nosy, to find out what are your practices, mindsets that you use to do all the brilliant things that you do, Paul? What are the things you do on a daily basis or weekly basis to keep yourself fresh, curious, empathetic, and so forth, and that others could learn from, perhaps?
Yeah, well, I don't know if they're all brilliant things. We're trying to do our best, obviously, to have an impact, but it's obviously the impact that ultimately counts, you know. I've often been asked, you do this great interview, how was the interview? And I've learned the hard way in my life, you have to wait for the interview to be published to see if it was the right way that you talk about it or not. So what we do is, I think it's very important to be physically fit. These are tremendous, if you want to work hard, it takes a physical toll. So that is an important thing you need to do. You need to have oxygen for new ideas, as we talked about it. So you need to have other hobbies, work with other people, read things, watch television if you want to, do cultural things. You have to get what I would call oxygen in, otherwise it doesn't work. I'd also think that you find a coping mechanism to relax, that gets your mind off things. That can be with your family, that can be in sports, but you have to carve out some time for yourself, what Stephen Covey calls sharpening the saw, and having, in that sense, some, I wouldn't call it downtime, but having that. So there are different things. At the end of the day, I like this pyramid of physical fitness, emotional fitness, mental fitness, and spiritual fitness, and you continuously have to work on all of those. And I'm lucky to have a wife that is supportive. I'm lucky to have a background also in religion that I lean on. I'm lucky to have a lot of friends that are there when I need them, and I'm lucky that I have the ability also to talk to a lot of people and learn a lot, and all these things are needed, I think, ultimately to set your priorities and to figure out where you can make the biggest difference. And that should be at the intersection of what you're good at, what the world needs, and obviously what you like to do. And if you find that sweet spot, which I've been very lucky to be operating in for a long time, I think you have all the chances to rise to your fullest potential and hopefully make a meaningful difference and ultimately leave this world in a little better place than we found it.
That's beautiful. I mean, you are an inspirational person, inspirational leader, a wonderful person, and a good person. I've seen that firsthand. I've seen it here today, and I applaud your work and your impact, most of all, and the impact you engender in others. And I hope this interview can make an incremental impact that's positive too with the listeners and viewers too. Paul, thank you for your time. That was enriching, that was moving, that was challenging. My head is spinning with ideas and actions I should be taking. That was another edition of Lancefield on the Line. If you enjoyed the series, please do have a look at the other interviews, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and give us a wonderful rating as you do. Thank you again, Paul.
Thank you, David, and hopefully see you soon. Be safe. Thanks.
Thank you.